Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the latest polls that have been released for the 2022 gubernatorial elections. As you can see here, in just the last couple of days, we have had a lot of new polls come out. The first polls from the state of Pennsylvania with Josh Shapiro up 4. We also have a lot of polls from Texas, Georgia, even Oklahoma, which is seemingly going to be a little bit closer than what we expected. We also have new polls from Minnesota, as well as a slew of new polls from the state of Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer against her potential Republican challengers as a result of the Maine frontrunners previously being disqualified for not having enough legitimate signatures. So that definitely did shake up the Michigan race. But today we'll be taking a look at the latest polls that have been released in the key races for the 2022 gubernatorial elections this November. We are now less than 5 months away, and we already have the candidates for many of these key races. So before we get started, I am going to fill in this map with the solid and likely states for both parties. These are really the races that, although it may get close at times, these races really are not going to end up being a huge deciding factor. The incumbent party is essentially going to win in all of these races, with the exception of the states of Maryland and Massachusetts. In Maryland, we have Larry Hogan, the Republican incumbent, and in Massachusetts, we have Charlie Baker, another Republican incumbent. Both of these incumbents will not be running in 2022, and so with no other strong Republicans in the field, the lieutenant governors are not going to be running. The Democratic Party is poised to take back both of these races. Joe Biden won Massachusetts by over 30 points, and in Maryland it was a margin of over 25 points. So both of these states are going to switch back to the Democratic Party. This is really very good news for the Democrats, as this will basically give them 2 free gains in the gubernatorial elections this November. However, it will still be difficult for them to hold on to many of their other races. One of the most vulnerable Democratic incumbents running for re-election right now is Laura Kelly in the state of Kansas. She was elected in 2018, defeating Republican Chris Kobach, and so this race in Kansas is going to be one of the worst for the Democratic Party. They're going to have to pump a lot of money in there if they want to end up holding this governorship again. But I think that as of right now, the state of Kansas is one that the Democrats should be very worried about going into November. It is the state of Kansas, and even though Laura Kelly won last time, Chris Kobach was an exceptionally horrible candidate. So we'll be taking a look at the polls in Kansas in just a few moments here, but I will be classifying both Texas and Florida as being likely for the GOP. Both of these states, although are not going to be that close, they are going to get a lot of attention because they're both very important states, second and third by population. So in Texas, Greg Abbott is doing very well against Beto O'Rourke, and same thing for Ron DeSantis against Charlie Crist in Florida. So I really do not see these two races getting too close, although they will still be very important ones that will still be heavily covered. I also have both the states of Iowa with Kim Reynolds and Ohio for Mike DeWine as being likely for the Republicans, and Phil Scott of Vermont and Kristen New of New Hampshire are pretty much going to win their races by solid margins in these two northeastern states. So this will give the GOP 24 governorships, 17 for the Democrats, and these 9 toss-up races are going to be the key races that will decide which party holds more governorships after the 2022 elections. And so looking at the 2018 results, these are the races that we will be seeing again this November. 23 governorships for the Democrats, 27 for the Republicans. This was up for the Democrats from 2014 when they only won 18. In 2021, of course, they did lose Virginia, so the Democratic Party currently holds 22 governorships while the Republicans have 28. So looking at the polls in the state of Nevada, Steve Sisolak here is running for his re-election, and in the previous election in 2018, he was elected to his first term with 49.3% of the vote. He was elected by a 4% margin. This was larger than both Catherine Cortez Master's margin, as well as both Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton's margins. So I do think that Steve Sisolak does start off at a little bit of a stronger position. He did win pretty comfortably last time, considering how close Nevada elections have begun to be. But Joe Lombardo is the 2022 Republican nominee, and if you do look at the predictions for this race, most of them do rank the Nevada race as being a toss-up, but looking at the polls between Steve Sisolak and Joe Lombardo, you will see that this race really is neck and neck. If you look at the latest polls here between the two individuals, you'll see that although Sisolak has led in most of the polls that have been released, as well as this latest one showing him up 12 points, in most of the recent ones, he is nowhere near 50%. There's a huge chunk of Nevada voters that are undecided, and with the national environment looking like it is right now, with Republicans up 2 in the generic ballot and Joe Biden at a very abysmal approval rating, I do think that most of these undecided voters are really not going to sway in favor of the Democrats. But in Nevada, I do think that Sisolak is in a little bit of a stronger position. He is relatively popular there, and if you compare him to Catherine Cortez Masto, who's running for re-election on the Senate level, I think that if Sisolak loses, Masto is definitely going to lose. So I do think that as of right now, I will categorize Nevada as being tilt for the Democratic Party. This is a very, very slim advantage I give to the Democratic Party, but I do think that as of right now, Steve Sisolak does go into November with a very slight advantage in his re-election. In the state of Arizona, this is another very close race in the southwestern region of the United States. In the state of Arizona, the main Republican candidates currently are Kari Lake and Karen Taylor Robson. I do think that Kari Lake will still end up on top. She did get the endorsement from Donald Trump, and even though Trump's endorsements against many incumbents have failed in terms of these primaries where there are no incumbents, Trump's endorsements have still been pretty effective. Typically, they do not get a majority of the vote, but they do get enough of a plurality to end up winning. So Kari Lake had been leading by pretty significant margins throughout the entire race. She has led in every single poll that has been released. However, as of right now, Robson is gaining on her, and Kari Lake is a former TV anchor for a local Fox News channel in Arizona. So if you do look at the Democratic primary here, though, Katie Hobbs a much stronger lead over her potential opponents in the Democratic primary. The primary is not until August, so we do have quite a ways to go until we really know who's going to be going up against each other in this race. And if you do look at the predictions here by these sources, you can see it is all tossed up across the board. But Katie Hobbs right now does have a polling advantage over Kari Lake. Hobbs has led in more polls, and if you do look at the polls between Hobbs and Taylor Robson, you will see that Katie Hobbs has led in both of these polls. So as of right now, I do think that the Republicans do actually have a slight advantage in this race. It is the state of Arizona. The state of Arizona is quite significantly a little bit more right-leaning than Nevada, and I think that with no incumbent on the Democrat side, I do think that it will be difficult, even though Kari Lake is not a good candidate and Katie Hobbs is a much better candidate. She is the incumbent Secretary of State of Arizona. I do feel that in this state, the Republicans do go into it with a slight advantage. Doug Ducey won by a 15-point margin in 2018 for his re-election, so he will no longer be able to run for a third term. However, I do think that right now the Republicans go in with a very slight advantage, but I mean, both of these races, Nevada and Arizona, you can see that both of them are pretty much toss-ups at this point. The race is still a little bit early, especially in Arizona where we don't even know the candidates yet, but both of these races will be heavily watched in the coming months. Next up is the state of Kansas. This is the big one for the Democrats, by far the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent that is running for re-election in this November's governor elections. In the state of Kansas, Laura Kelly is running for her re-election. In 2018, of course, she won 48% of the vote in Kansas, defeating Chris Kobach. Now, Kansas electing Democratic governors is not that crazy, but still in a year like 2018, where these governor races are also getting a lot more politicized than they were before, I think that this was definitely an impressive victory. Of course, Chris Kobach was a horrible candidate, but in 2022, I think that it will be a lot more difficult for her because, of course, she is not running against Chris Kobach anymore. If you look at the rankings here, you will see that many of these sources have it as being lean for the Republican Party. And if you look at Derek Schmidt is the frontrunner currently for the GOP primary, and he is the current Attorney General of the state of Kansas and has been for over a decade now. So Derek Schmidt, I think, is going to perform relatively well here against Laura Kelly. I do think that this race will still be close. It will still be one in which an incumbent is running in, so I don't expect Laura Kelly to get destroyed, but I do think that in the end, she is going to lose, and I don't think think that is too surprising to anyone. It is very unfortunate, though. She is running in one of the worst states for the Democratic Party in a year where Democrats are not popular. I think if we had another year like 2018, where Trump was the president and Republicans controlled Congress, I do think that it would have been a lot easier for Laura Kelly. But in 2022, with there not being a terrible candidate on the GOP side, it will be very difficult for her. So I will categorize Kansas as being lean for the GOP. And before we move any further, make sure to join my Discord server if you have not, the link to which is at the very top of the description below. And moving on to the state of Minnesota, we have incoming Governor Tim Walz running for his re-election. He was first elected in 2018. This race is a little bit closer than what I initially thought, although Inside Elections does have it as being solid, but most of the rankings do give Democrats a significant advantage here. Scott Jensen is the current Republican frontrunner. The candidates here have not been chosen yet. If you look at the candidates here on the Republican side, Scott Jensen is really the only major candidate. He is a former state senator, so for only 4 years though. But if you look at the polling here, you will see that Tim Walz is doing okay. He has been leading in the polls that have been released, but I do think that you can see here his margin is decreasing from December to May of this year. This is all done by Survey USA. If you look at this Change Research post, Tim Walz is only up 2 in the latest poll that has been released. So I am going to categorize Minnesota as being lean for the Democrats. I do think that Tim Walz, as an incumbent, is likely to win his race, but this race can definitely still get close in the coming months. In the state of Wisconsin, another very vulnerable incumbent Democrat. This time it is Tony Evers. Tony Evers first won in 2018 alongside Mandela Barnes. He will be running for the Senate now. So Tony Evers is going to have to find a new running mate. But I think that for his race, he is pretty vulnerable. If you look at the Republican side, though, it is a divided primary. Rebecca Kleefisch, the former lieutenant governor under Scott Walker, the incumbent that Tony Evers defeated in 2018, who is running for a third term. Rebecca Kleefisch has led in most of the polls that have been released. This final one, though, does show Tim Mitchell's in the lead. Tim Mitchell's recently got the endorsement of Donald Trump, so that really is the only reason why. So I think that right now, Tim Mitchell's actually has a very good chance at winning this nomination. And so if you look at the rankings here, all of them are toss-ups. We do not have polls between Mitchell's and Evers yet, but looking at the polls between Evers and Kleefisch, you'll see that this race is very close. However, if you do look at the electoral history of the state of Wisconsin, the party in the White House typically loses the gubernatorial election here. That this rule has been true for over the last 20 years, and I'm not going by this rule. I'm just saying that Wisconsin is a state that Joe Biden barely won. Tony Evers won by 1% in 2018, and looking at this graph here, just right here, I really don't see Tony Evers winning his re-election at this point in time. I will give this as a tilt for the Republicans currently. I think that it will still be a very close race. You do still have an incumbent running for their re-election, but it will be very difficult for Tony Evers in the next couple of months. Moving on to the state of Michigan, I think that Gretchen Whitmer is going to have a lot easier of a time winning her re-election. She is already the presumptive nominee. On the Republican side, of course, if you do look at the polls here, you'll see James Craig, the former frontrunner, was basically disqualified. He is currently debating whether or not he will run as a write-in candidate, but he did not get enough valid signatures. There was a lot of fraudulent ones, but Ryan Kelly now seems to be the frontrunner in this race, but we're really going to have to see. There are just so many candidates, and basically this is the race starting over. So if you look at the latest rankings here, the Republicans are poised to lose this race. Gretchen Whitmer is okay in terms of her popularity. She's been very unpopular at times during the height of the pandemic, but as of right now, she is doing all right. If you look at the polls between Gretchen Whitmer and her potential Republican opponents, I think this is good news. Now, obviously, this is a result of the fact that nobody really knows these candidates too well, as of course they really did not campaign too significantly, or they did not receive that much attention because they were not the frontrunners at all before James Craig was knocked out. So if you do look at these latest polls here, it is obviously very good news for Gretchen Whitmer, but in the end, I don't expect the race to be that close or that much of I don't expect there to be that huge of a margin for Whitmer in the end, so I will categorize Michigan as being lean for the Democrats right now. I think that in the end, she will still do relatively well in her re-election. Next up is the state of Pennsylvania. We finally got polls from Pennsylvania. If you look at the gubernatorial election here, Josh Shapiro against Doug Mastriano. Josh Shapiro is the current attorney general. I think that Mastriano is not a good candidate, and most of these predictions do signify that. In 2018, Tom Wolf, the incumbent who cannot run for re-election, won by a very solid margin, I believe around 18 points. So if you do look at the 2022 race here, though, the one poll release does show Shapiro up by 4 points against Mastriano. And if you look at the Senate polls, we did get one Senate poll that I do want to show you guys. John Fetterman, this is the only poll released anytime recently in Pennsylvania for the Senate race. John Fetterman leads by 9 points over amendment odds. This is the same poll USA Today, Suffolk. So if you look at the governor poll here, you will see that Fetterman is doing better than Shapiro. So I'm going to still categorize Pennsylvania currently as being tilt for the Democrats. I do think they have a little bit of advantage. Even though Shapiro was leading, you have to consider the fact that he really was only at 44%, nowhere near a majority there. So I'm going to give Pennsylvania a tilt for the Democrats. Next up, in the state of Maine up north there, in the state of Maine, currently Janet Mills running against Paula Page. Paula Page is the former two-term governor. Janet Mills is running to become a two-term governor this November. So you cannot run for a third consecutive term in Maine, but you can't run for a third non-consecutive term. That's exactly what Paula Page is doing. If you look at the numbers here, Mills is leading over the former governor, and she has led in every single poll by a pretty stable margin basically throughout the entirety of the last year from May 2021 to May of this year. Janet Mills has been pretty stable in her numbers, and I do think that she goes into her race with an advantage as the incumbent. Maine is a state that will favor the Democrats, and I think that honestly this is closer than what it really should be. Joe Biden won the state by almost double digits. And finally, in the state of Georgia, this is the last one here, and we have a rematch between Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams. In 2018, the race was very close. This made Stacey Abrams very famous, like it did with Beto O'Rourke. Stacey Abrams has since helped John Ossoff and Ralph Warnock both get elected last year, but I think that 2022 will be a little bit different for her. Again, I mean, just looking at these numbers here, it is not favorable for the Democratic Party. And there were actually a lot of calls about fraud and stuff like that in 2018. They were actually substantiated, but in the end, even though her numbers might have gone up a little bit, they really weren't enough to actually help her win. So Stacey Abrams has since founded the Fair Fight Action, and that has been promoting more voters, especially voters of color, to come out and vote, basically increasing the amount, basically trying to fight voter suppression is basically what she's been doing. But in this race, it is going to be difficult for her. Brian Kemp is now the incumbent, and even though he defied Trump, he won his nomination by a significant margin. So, of course, he did not help Trump overturn the election results in Georgia. But if you do look at the primary results, Brian Kemp, even though Trump poured millions of dollars and a lot of support, even campaign rallies for David Perdue, Brian Kemp won 74% of the vote against a Trump-endorsed candidate, and David Perdue is a former senator. He won his own Senate race in 2014 as the Republican, and now he merely cracked 22% within his own party in the state of Georgia. So I think that Brian Kemp is in a very good position right now. I mean, he just won his primary by a huge margin and has led in every single poll against Stacey Abrams. If you look at the 2018 polls, you'll see that Stacey Abrams actually led in a lot of the polls. Although Kemp always did a little bit better, Stacey Abrams did lead in a significant amount. If you look at all the polls that were released, there were quite a few that actually showed Stacey Abrams ahead at the very end. So the numbers here in Georgia are relatively accurate. They were accurate for both 2018 and 2020 on the presidential and Senate levels. So I think that these numbers are very discouraging for the Democrats. And if you look at the graph here, you'll see that Kemp leads on average on 538 by 6.3% at this point in time. So I am going to categorize the state of Georgia as being lean for the Republicans. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. 28 for the Republicans, 22 for the Democrats. Basically no change, but the Democrats really did benefit hugely from those flips in Maryland and Massachusetts. So again, thank you so much for watching. Comment down below how you feel about the 2022 races. Subscribe to my channel if you have not, and I'll see you guys in the next one.